When you think of a shopping mall, what do you think of? You probably think of being dragged through a sea of clothing stores against your will for hours and hours and hours, with nothing really to look forward to except for the occasional mall pretzel. Yeah, when I think of malls today, they're kind of boring and bland. It's like, what's even the point when I can just go buy stuff online then? But this wasn't always the case. My childhood mall was the Rivertown Crossings Mall in Granville, Michigan, about 15 minutes away from Grand Rapids. The mall still exists today, and every once in a while we go there, but really there's no point to go there anymore. But for a mall in the modern era, it's doing pretty good. Most of the little stores are pretty stable there, and the anchor stores are doing pretty good, especially for the time being. Even if it's just half the store and the other half where Sears used to be is pretty much a dead zone, it's still pretty alright. But again, there's not really much to do other than just shopping. But when I was 3 years old, there was something that I always looked forward to every time we went to the mall. Not too far away from the food court on the Sears side of the mall, there was this wonderful shop, and it was NASCAR related. Let me tell you guys about one of the coolest shops in the mall, the grandfather of iRacing, and one of the biggest reasons I'm a NASCAR fan today. Let me tell you guys about Silicon Motor Speedway.
Welcome to Silicon Motor Speedway.
Silicon Motor Speedway. The very popular and high-tech mall attraction that was gone before we even got to see its potential. Despite its short 13-year run, it was very popular with everyone, from NASCAR fans to the average Joes. It was a nice little fun for the whole family twist to your trip to the mall. Basically, it was essentially a NASCAR store and a full-fledged NASCAR motion simulator. As while you would race on one of the various NASCAR tracks, your car would bump and bang around like you were racing in a real car. It's one of those things that, despite failing financially, it was still popular to its dying day. And while my memory is still vague, since the only times I was in one of these things was when I was a toddler, I remember having the time of my life driving in those things. Or well, really riding in those things. My dad would drive them. But despite its popularity, it would completely fall from the face of the earth in the 2010s, to the point where I can't really think of any place that still even has any of these things. It's honestly insane that something so big and popular would completely vanish in a few short years after its closure. But what led to this thing's rise and fall? Why was it so popular? And more importantly, what even were these things? Well, let's go back to the beginning. The very beginning. The year is 1994, and NASCAR is finally starting to pick up some steam and get into the mainstream. While there are a few NASCAR games and occasional rides here and there, nothing really got to attempt a simulation of the real thing. By this point in time, not even Papyrus's NASCAR racing game even hit the scene yet, so the idea of a NASCAR-themed simulator is still an untapped market by this point in time. And the first people to recognize this is a little Silicon Valley team by the name of Location-Based Entertainment Technologies. And while I really don't know what really led to the inspiration of creating a NASCAR-themed simulator, I want to believe they got the idea from like those little horse rides you see, like the Sandy rides at Meijer stores if you're from the Midwest. While the backstory behind Silicon Motor Speedway is still relatively vague, we do, however, know its development and the person behind it. And later on in 1994, Location-Based Entertainment Technologies would approach a man by the name of Jim Riordan. By the mid-90s, Riordan is practically a veteran in the entertainment industry and has worked on developing numerous toys and games from companies like Hasbro and Atari. And while this was most likely his most boldest task yet, he passed it with flying colors, as he would have the first prototype done within 5 months. What his product would be was essentially a miniature race car on a motion platform that would react to real-time feedback. And what he would create would be really realistic, and he wanted to make sure that, even hiring 1990 Indy 500 winner Arie Luyendyk to help tweak out some of the realism with it. And by the time 1996 rolled around, Riordan's final project was ready for testing. Now this is something really important I'd like to point out with a lot of what's going to be in this video. as a lot of the information about this stuff has been lost to time. And a lot of the information I have is from Silicon Motor Speedway's old website with the help of Wayback Machine. This is important because the time between Riordan finishing his prototypes and the grand opening of Silicon Motor Speedway is pretty much lost. But I do want to imagine the time between 1996 and 1997 was spent testing as well as programming the main software. But all I know for sure was that LBET was going head over heels for this stuff, with even the CEO at the time being hopelessly addicted to this thing. They essentially knew that this was going to be a hit for sure. But before their grand opening, Riordan encouraged location-based entertainment technologies to contact NASCAR for their endorsement. And not too long later, NASCAR happily gave them their endorsement, including some big stars at the time, like Dale Earnhardt, Dale Jarrett, Rusty Wallace, Jeff Gordon, Kenny Irwin Jr., Jeremy Mayfield, and Dale Earnhardt Jr. happily supporting this thing. With Riordan's cars being painted with the colors and logos of the NASCARs at the time, it was finally time to open up Silicon Motor Speedway.
Oh, it was terrific.
It gives you a real rush.
It just gives you the feeling that you're actually sitting in the car driving. It's really cool.
This is NASCAR Silicon Motor Speedway, the most realistic interactive racing experience in the world. An opportunity to see if you've got what it takes to be a NASCAR Winston Cup champion.
Great. It was actually like great being there in the car. It was great.
I've been a closet race car driver all my life. I bet there are a lot of us little old grandmothers out there who want to do this.
It's just like you're there. I mean, they hit you from behind and you're spinning around, and it's cool.
We've opened our first facility at the Mall of America in Minneapolis. The results have been fantastic, and we're opening new facilities across the country in the next couple of years.
On September 3rd, 1997, the very first Silicon Motor Speedway would open its doors in the Mall of America. And this was huge at the time, with Rusty Wallace and the aforementioned Arie Luyendyk being there at the grand opening. And needless to say, this was an instant hit, as this was extremely popular with everyone. As back in the day, people were saying this was one of the most realistic experiences they've ever had. And while yeah, this might sound silly now, people were blown away by this in 1997. Later on that year, some other NASCAR drivers would make a stop at Silicon Motor Speedway, like Dale Earnhardt Sr., Jeff Gordon, Michael Waltrip, and Dale Jarrett. It was already such a huge popular thing at the time that LBET was already thinking about expansions. And by the time 2000 hit, they did that and more. Including locations in Charlotte, Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, Nashville, Birmingham, and even Universal Studios Hollywood had a location. And of course, this little known mall in the middle of nowhere by the name of Rivertown Crossings, but that's not important. It's not like that's the whole reason this video exists. But needless to say, this entire thing was taking the country by storm. And the fact this was taking place right smack dab in NASCAR's popularity boom in the late 90s and early 2000s made its expansion even better and more popular. And everyone couldn't wait to get behind the wheel of these amazing simulators. Now that we talked about how Silicon Motor Speedway came to be, let's talk about how it basically worked. Tickets for the rides at Silicon Motor Speedway would be costing $8.50, which, adjusting for inflation today, would be about $15. And while that might sound like a lot, you're basically running a 12-lap race in the high-tech racing simulator, so it's worth it. Then once you buy your ticket, you head to the registration area. And while information about this stuff is relatively little, I'm guessing that you put in your name, the track you want to race at, and your preferred car. The three original tracks were Charlotte, Bristol, and Richmond, but later on in its life, Daytona, Atlanta, and Indianapolis were also added to the list. The cars you could choose from varied from place to place, but most of them were pretty much the same. The ones I remembered at Rivertown were Dale Jarrett, Tony Stewart, and Elliott Sadler, and I think there might have been a Dale Jr. one as well. And according to some old stuff from Brent Jones on Twitter, apparently there was also a Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon one there too. The races then would be assorted by color, which according to what I could find was basically red races and blue races, but I'm pretty sure there were some other colors too. Once you're finished registering, you get a card, and then once your race pops up, you go to your car and scan the card. The cage around the car would open and you could hop into your car. Every single car was a two-seater, with the passenger seat having a computer screen with a bird's eye view of the car. And every driver was allowed to take a passenger with them free of charge. And of course, that's how I managed to have my experience with Silicon Motor Speedway. The cars were automatic by default, but if you wanted to, you could register your car to be manual and use the stick shift. Once you were all buckled up and ready to go, the simulator would begin. As the announcer counted down from 10, your car would adjust to the track and get ready for racing. And according to some old stuff on Silicon Motor Speedway's old website, you had to turn on your car first before you could race. While it is really realistic, I could easily see it being pretty annoying to some new players. The starting position depends on what track you're racing at, with Charlotte Motor Speedways beginning on pit road, Daytona starting right at the start-finish line, and etc, etc. Once you immediately hit the throttle, you'll feel it, as the car will jolt back almost like you're actually starting to accelerate a real car. As you race around the track, your car will adjust to bank changes with almost pinpoint accuracy. Like I mentioned before, Riordan did everything in his power to make sure this was as realistic as it gets, especially with the crashes. If you bump into the wall or another car, you'll feel the car jolt around like you're in a pinball machine. And apparently, according to this comment from OBD1 and down, the cars could also flip as well. I didn't even know that was possible, and even according to the comments, not even the employees knew it was possible. But fortunately enough, if the motion becomes too overwhelming for you, every car is equipped with an emergency stop button. Pressing it would immediately stop the simulation and an employee would come to make sure everything's okay. Then if you want to, you could still finish the race, albeit without the motion. After the race is all said and done, you get a certificate with your lap times and how well you did. Now here's where things get pretty interesting. If your lap times are quick enough, you can actually join Silicon Motor Speedway's Drivers Club. You get your very own Silicon Motor Speedway's driver's license and also get some pretty insane benefits, like discounts for races, the ability to reserve cars ahead of time, and even merchandise discounts at the stores. There's also one more benefit, but we'll get to that later. Once you're all said and done with the simulator, you can head over to the merch store and get some really cool merchandise, like t-shirts, hats, flags, jackets, and of course everyone's favorite thing, diecast. And I'm not talking about the puny stuff you get at Walmart, no, I'm talking about the action of the Team Caliber cars. I think I can safely say that half of my original diecast collection came from Silicon Motor Speedway. Of course now they're all beaten to a pulp and the cars I keep in perfect condition are from eBay, so meh. But overall, Silicon Motor Speedway was just a giant NASCAR area for everyone. You could do some exciting racing and get some NASCAR stuff during your trip to the mall. But it all just wasn't the fun and games kind of thing. There was a far more serious side of Silicon Motor Speedway, and the final benefit to the Drivers Club. If you were part of the Drivers Club, you could actually participate in competitive races. That's right, way before iRacing hit the scene, there was the Silicon Motor Speedway Cup Series. And every once in a while, they would hold their very own exclusive races that were significantly longer from the regular Silicon Motor Speedway races. The casual races would be about 12 to 15 laps, while the competitive races would go up to 60 and sometimes even 100 laps. Not only were there smaller leagues at the individual stores, there was also a national championship as well. And while most of the competitive history is left in the dark, we do know, however, one name. The 1999 champion of the Silicon Motor Speedway Cup Series, Joseph Smalley. Yeah, we really don't know what he looks like nowadays, especially since a lot of the JPEGs on Silicon Motor Speedway's website is completely dead now. But I have a solid feeling he's a Chad that gets all the babes. After all, he is the king of the Silicon Motor Speedway. But needless to say, there was a lot of professionals that were in this league. Some of the other big names included Ryan Smith, Ken Lamer, Patrick Wyrick, John McNamara, and Mike Castleberry, just to name a few. And a lot of these competitive leagues had some pretty big prize pools as well, with Patrick Wyrick winning the '98 championship, bringing home $5,000 in prize money. But despite his popularity, the competitive leagues started to fade away by the time 2000 and 2001 hit. Because despite his popularity, something drastic was about to happen. And the end days were about to begin with Silicon Motor Speedway. By the time 2000 came to an end and 2001 was beginning, Silicon Motor Speedway looked like it had a bright future. Not only was it pretty popular with both fans and mall goers alike, but it kept expanding to new locations. Things were looking great for Silicon Motor Speedway. However, in April 2001, Silicon Motor Speedway came to a grinding halt, as everyone was shocked to find out that every single Silicon Motor Speedway would be closing their doors until further notice. The reason being, LBET had gone bankrupt and completely shut down. Remember I said that LBET was doing everything in their power to expand as much as possible? Well, it came back and bit them. They might have seen some small success and was pretty popular, sure, but all that success came with a cost. And they lost practically $30 million in that short period of time. Silicon Motor Speedway was successful, but not successful enough to keep their parent company afloat. So LBET decided to bite the bullet and close everything down until they could figure things out. Fortunately, customers didn't have to wait too long, as in April of 2002, the Silicon Motor Speedways opened back up once again. Location-based entertainment technologies, now under the name Silicon Entertainment Incorporated, has now decided to take a different approach with their business strategy. Instead of opening up dedicated stores for their racing simulators, they decided instead to just simply sell the racing simulators and then have their customers do the rest of the work. SEI would call these things revenue share locations, and they saw a lot more success and a lot more expansion than their initial idea of just opening up new stores. Even some of their old Silicon Motor Speedways would be rebranded into revenue share locations, and one of which happened to be the Rivertown Crossings location, as in 2003 it would be rebranded to Checkered Flag Lightning. So now all that SEI had to do was just focus on building the simulators and selling them. And they had some pretty big clients that helped it expand to bigger and better places. Some of these locations include the Nascar Speed Park, some Bass Pro Shops had a couple of them, Daytona USA would have the Acceleration Alley, which would be dedicated to these simulators, and even some Carnival cruises had some for a short period of time. Initially, this new business model worked perfectly for them, and they doubled the amount of locations they had, whether it be full-fledged Silicon Motor Speedways or some of those more revenue-shared ones. However, not too long later, a new problem began to arise. This new problem had nothing to do with the Silicon Motor Speedway itself. At this point in time, it was actually at the peak of its popularity. But at this point in time, it's currently the mid-2000s, and a new chapter in American consumerism was about to start. The advent of online shopping. Online shopping sites like eBay and Amazon were starting to pick up steam at this point in time. And while at this point in time they weren't the corporate conglomerates they are now, it was starting to drastically change how Americans would shop. And thus, mall attendance was starting to decrease, and less people started to come to Silicon Motor Speedway. And while mall goers still said it was a go-to attraction, it was starting to show that they weren't invincible. And following the peak of their popularity in 2005, what would follow would be an absolute collapse within the next 5 years. As one by one, both the dedicated Silicon Motor Speedways and the revenue share locations would close down and bow out. And around 2006 and 2007, the Rivertown location would close its door for the final time. And while I was extremely upset to see it go, I could tell it wasn't going to last much longer. Especially at the end of 2006, Checkered Flag Lightning decided to just completely close the simulators entirely and just have it as a store. And it wasn't just Silicon Motor Speedway, that entire area around Sears just completely died between 2006 and 2008. However, the non-mall locations were still relatively stable. The Nascar Speed Parks in Daytona USA racked in thousands of customers a season. At this point in time, that looked like it was going to be the future of Silicon Motor Speedway, just as a fun attraction in already established NASCAR areas. And while it definitely fell a lot since its popularity peak, it was definitely a nice place to be. But of course, they had yet another problem. This was NASCAR in the late 2000s, and it was starting to fall off from the mainstream. Keep in mind, Silicon Motor Speedway originally came because of the popularity boom in the 90s. But by the time Silicon Motor Speedway's 10th anniversary came around, the NASCAR bandwagon was already long gone, as many of these locations would start seeing decreases in attendance around this time. And interestingly enough, another thing was happening around this time. It's NASCAR in 2007 and a brand new era was about to arise, the era of the car of tomorrow. Silicon Motor Speedway was still using the same molds and models from its original date in 1997. And by the time the car of tomorrow was starting to become mainstream, its age was really starting to show, as practically everyone would begin seeing the car of tomorrow paint schemes on the old cars of yesterday. Not only was it starting to look cosmetically dated, but also mechanically dated as well, as at this point in time, many of the simulators would frequently fall out of commission. And yet Silicon Motor Speedway was still charging the same price as they did in 1997. So ticket sales would begin to go down once again. But despite that, the following was still relatively big. Despite its age and unreliability, people still loved these things, as at the time it was really the only way to really have a true NASCAR experience. Second to actually getting behind the wheel of an actual car. It was the go-to NASCAR simulator. But then in August of 2008, a brand new game would hit the scene by the name of iRacing. Now racing fans could have a full-fledged racing simulator in the comfort of their own home. And just like that, what was once one of the most high-tech and realistic racing simulators 1 decade prior was now obsolete. When Silicon Motor Speedway first came out, racing simulators at home looked like this. But now they were starting to look like this. And over this time, Silicon Motor Speedway did not change one bit when it came to the quality, as the motion gimmick was kind of overrated at this point. And even if you still did like the motion gimmick, you could easily get your very own motion simulator for iRacing if you have the money for it. And thus, iRacing hammered the final nail in the coffin for Silicon Motor Speedway. In 2008, Silicon Entertainment Inc. once again rebranded, this time calling themselves the Interactive Motorsports and Entertainment Company. As at this point in time, the race simulators were basically all they had. and there were only a handful of locations that still had them, including the Silicon Motor Speedway at the Mall of America, which in a cruel twist of events, the very first Silicon Motor Speedway would also become the very last. Despite the struggles and turmoil Silicon Motor Speedway went through in the past 3 years up to this point, it was still a cult classic within the Mall of America, and IMEC would do everything in their power to try to preserve it, as it was their last remnants of their golden years. But despite their efforts, their death was inevitable. Later on in 2008, NASCAR would drop their endorsement and focus more on iRacing. Silicon Motor Speedway would be rebranded into IMTS, but the Mall of America location was still called the Silicon Motor Speedway and still sold NASCAR merch. But they weren't entirely done with the racing simulator gig, as around this time in 2008 they would try out creating some mobile locations. However, they do a lot of downgrading to make it a lot more cost efficient, including not using the Silicon Motor Speedway software, instead just using NR2003. What was once one of the most advanced and state-of-the-art race simulators was now nothing short of a cheap carnival ride. I actually remember when a couple of these things actually came to Meyer once. It was just an Edie's company promotion and all the cars were under the Edie's brands, but I came to those cars excited and left disappointed, and I think my dad went the same way. It had been a long time since we'd been in those cars, and we ended up finding out it wasn't what we remembered. By the time the 2000s came to a close, Silicon Motor Speedway was looking relatively stable. It was nowhere near at the level it was earlier in the decade, but it was still alright. It had an equal amount of people that were thrill seekers and people that wanted to go on a nostalgia trip that remember the old days of Silicon Motor Speedway. And the Mall of America location was still relatively popular enough to where they even opened up a Twitter page, albeit just for merchandise promotions. But these simulators were still popular at a lot of their revenue shared locations like the NASCAR Speed Parks and Daytona USA. I think they were relatively satisfied with their new spot as just a fun little ride. But of course, this would have been a way too happy of an ending for them, as things were about to go horrible heading into 2010. In April of 2010, IMEC would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Despite its efforts, it couldn't save itself. And later on that month, the final Silicon Motor Speedway in the Mall of America would close its doors for the final time. Today, their old Silicon Motor Speedway location is now the Cadillac Ranch Bar and Grill. Not too long after Silicon Motor Speedway's closure, IMEC completely folded and fell off the face of the earth. And because of that, the last remaining Silicon Motor Speedway simulators were no longer supported. And one by one, their revenue share locations would pull out their simulators and scrap them. In 2011, Daytona USA would pull their simulators out. The old Acceleration Alley is now just walls that talk about Daytona's construction. The NASCAR Speed Parks would end up pulling theirs out as well. And while the Pigeon Forge location tried to bring them back in 2015, after I emailed about it, it looked like they didn't last too long and they were pulled out once again. It's honestly kind of sad seeing that a lot of these high-tech and state-of-the-art racing simulators would end up turning into scrap metal by the time the 2010s rolled around. A relic of NASCAR's past that was torn down before people knew the value of it. And by 2017, most of the Silicon Motor Speedway simulators were all gone. Silicon Motor Speedway at this point was nothing more than a vague memory, as all their locations at this point were long closed. Universal Studios Silicon Motor Speedway is now a candy store. Its old Houston location is now an indoor playground. And Concord Mills Silicon Motor Speedway met the same fate as the speed park there and now turned into the mall's aquarium. But many of them, much like the Rivertown location, has been sitting abandoned for years. What's once held the sounds and speed of NASCAR is now just empty rooms. And thus, not only was Silicon Motor Speedway only in the history books, it was completely ripped out of them and thrown in the trash. It's such a sad fate for what was once one of the most high-tech and advanced things in the world. But however, not all of them are gone. A man by the name of Jack Dowel is actually working on restoring a few of these things, and even uses one of them as an iRacing rig. I'm actually kind of happy to see that they're not all gone, that someone's actually working on restoring a few of these things, even if it's not used in the authentic way. But that's the story of Silicon Motor Speedway, one of NASCAR's biggest attractions at the time that would end up falling from grace because of a plethora of problems. From LBET expanding way too quickly, to it being a product of NASCAR's 90s boom, and the fact that it was an investment on technology. And as we all know, technology always advances. And now, it's nothing short than a vague memory. And it's honestly a darn shame, because I feel like these things deserve a lot more recognition than it gets. Not just for NASCAR, but for racing games in general. Its motion simulator was one of the very first of its time, now seen in a lot of professional racing rigs today. Heck, even some NASCAR teams use some updated racing rigs to help their drivers train. And then we got the competitive leagues that use the help. This would end up paving the way for a lot of the e-competitive series you see nowadays. And today, competitive racing leagues are all over the place, especially tons endorsed by NASCAR. Silicon Motor Speedway might be long gone, but its impact on NASCAR is heavily looked over. Nowadays, it's occasionally looked on as a fun little memory, but it had a much bigger impact than that. At one point, it was one of NASCAR's biggest fan experiences, a must-go attraction at every single mall it was located in. Many mall goers at Rivertown Crossings don't know what was in that old tenement, what's now an empty room, but I do remember. It was a space of speed and excitement right in the middle of NASCAR's hot streak, and a world of racing so real, you can feel it.